Buddy, and this is the first lecture for our course, Chapter 1, which is actually getting into the nuts and bolts of our course. So what you see here is not something you're going to be tested on. It's just sort of how I've, if you will, mapped the different areas of human experience. And I'll probably create some kind of lecture to go over this or share some podcast or something. But, this is just kind of how I would symbolize the philosophical process. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into our chapter. So basically we're going to be looking at what is philosophy, the traditional divisions of philosophy, take a look at a philosopher in action, and talk about the value of philosophy. I'm really only doing these lectures in order for you to hear me talk about this material. Some people need more than the textbook. I'll also post up the slides for you, but I'm not going to tell you anything that's not in the textbook, or very little that's not in the textbook. So we'll just kind of run through this material, and hopefully you'll find by listening to this lecture things that will be the most important for when you do your group discussion and when you write your essay. Also, what you might want to go back over and study for your quiz, for your chapter quiz. All right. So what is philosophy? Well, you've already read the Getting Philosophy into Your Lexicon, which was something I wrote about my thinking about philosophy. So you already know that the word philosophy actually means love of wisdom, or the attempt to endear yourself to cleverness or through cleverness. And as it's pointed out again and again throughout this text and throughout the history of philosophy, the idea is that philosophizing begins in a wonder or marveling at some circumstance or the world itself. And its goal, really more than anything else, is to become a kind of art of question asking, so that you can critically develop your own viewpoint and critically engage the world in such a way that you are freer than if you did not do that. So the first thing we do is we take a look at what's really probably one of the most famous things that Plato wrote outside of the Apology of Socrates, and that's this myth of the cave, or the allegory of the cave, which is from his greatest work, The Republic. And what you want to do here is you want to go over it. You want to really kind of consider it. I believe that there's a video specifically about this. If you look in MindTap, you'll see there's a couple of videos for Chapter 1, not just the ones that are actually in the that are actually there in the, like the activator video and the lecture video, but that there's actually a video about the myth of the cave in a section, and it has a due date on it, so you want to take a look at that. I believe it's only for looking. There's no activity that goes with it, but look for those videos, because there's about 15 of them that you'll be able to watch, or 14 of them that you'll be able to watch over the course of the semester, that can help you understand these materials a little better. But what you really basically want to do with the Allegory of the Cave is, understand what the setting of it is, where does it come, what's the back and forth that's happening between Socrates and his friend, and then just kind of know the basic ideas, the basic happenings or actions inside of the thing. And the whole purpose, of course, for getting the Allegory of the Cave is that it's a myth, meaning the Greek word mythos, actually means narrative. So the Greek word for narrative is myth. So the narrative describes a climb from the dark cave of ignorance into the light of knowledge and wisdom. It kind of starts off finding, in media res, with the person sort of Socrates describing a situation in which people find themselves chained up, staring at shadows and mistaking the shadows for reality. My original ancient philosophy teacher, many moons ago, when some of y'all weren't even born, pointed out that the way some people just sit in front of the television, or now we would say the computer screen, or in front of, with their phone in front of their face, is very reminiscent of the sort of things that Plato is actually capturing when he talks about people chained looking at shadows that pretend to be reality, or they think that's reality, but it's not. It's all fake news. So, as the story kind of unfolds, as Socrates describes to Glaucon, his friend he's talking to, more of what's going on, their basic idea is, well, what would happen if somebody freed that person who'd been chained, and that person turned around and kind of, like it's what happens anytime any of us go into a bright place from a dark place. Our eyes are blinded for a moment, right? When you step out of the house in August in Texas and you've been in your dark apartment with the lights off and the windows, the shades drawn and the air conditioner running, and then you walk outside at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and it's just bright sunlight and it's so hot and you can't see at first. In fact, you squint and close your eyes even if you're wearing shades, right? So first, what would happen when you turn around is you'd be blinded by the brilliance of what you're looking at. But even here, the person isn't actually looking at reality. They're looking at the stuff that makes the shadows on the wall, right? That stuff itself is still just a copy, right? So the shadows are a copy of a copy. And then what the men and women are moving around on the dais and talking about are these copies of what's real outside of the cave. Okay? So now you got to struggle up the hill and get outside of the cave. And when you take that struggle, when you do it, what you begin to realize is, after you get out there, again, you're blinded again, then you have to get reacclimated. But as you begin to look, you begin to see natural instead of, right, you can call the stuff that was on the dais that had the flame and the puppets and what have you that were being manipulated, you can call those artifacts, right? They're it's the artifact of a tree, it's the artifact of a dog, it's the artifact of a person. But when you get outside and you look, you see the tree, you see the dog, you look at yourself, you see yourself, and maybe you see other people walking around in the distance and you're like, oh, that's the real thing, right? And then you have that moment where you realize that all of this is seeable because of the light of the sun, right? So philosophy here means you turn around because you want to see this to everybody, you want to let everybody know about this. But when you understand that philosophy is not an outcome, but you're going to go back down into there and you're going to be blinded as soon as you go into the dark from the light. It's the same thing. Go back home at 4 p.m. on an August afternoon and walk back into your apartment after being out in the bright sunshine, and you'll be blinded for a little while. So the same kind of blinding happens going back down. And when you get back down there, you're just trying to get people to see they need to participate in this project of critical thinking, of searching and exploring and attempting to accomplish liberation. But it's an activity. It's not I've done it and now I don't have to do it anymore. Right? One thing I've discovered out of doing philosophy for as long as I've done it is that I'm constantly redoing my opinions. Right? They're becoming better, and then sometimes they become so honed. If I re-examine them, I realize that I've dropped off something important, or that I'm just totally wrong and I need to change what I'm doing. So the basic idea here is once you understand that philosophy is always on the way, it's an activity, right? It's the trip. It's not the destination. It becomes something that you'll do for the rest of your life there will never be any rest from it in a certain kind of way, because your ultimate activity for doing this is to achieve freedom or liberation. And that means you have to examine all of the things that you hold as a basic assumption. At any given moment in time, philosophers find themselves persona non grata in any number of situations, unwelcome visitors in any number of situations, whether you're talking about the right or the left, or you're talking about atheists or religionists or whatever the case may be, because philosophers show up and they begin to test, critique, imagine other circumstances, and therefore undermine what are held as common basic assumptions. But they're not just held as basic assumptions, right? They're held as laws, or they're held as natural structures instead of human customs of thinking, instead of human behaviors that we've just gotten used to doing. So in this notion of examining basic assumptions, that's really the basic assumptions that you don't examine are the chains that hold you in place. So if you really want to become a lover of wisdom, if you really want to become someone who endears themselves to the sort of basic cleverness of being, you have to go in and you have to be willing to examine every major thing you hold dear, and just make a determination about how sure you are of that thing. Because, sometimes by the time we're 20 or 30 years old, a lot of times we have adopted as sure that's exactly the way the world is, and that's the only way the world is. A lot of the ways that we've adopted that is just to take from people we respect their idea. Like, I don't want you to leave this class and see the world the way I see it. I want you to leave this class and have challenged your basic assumptions because of your engagement with this material and possibly with me, so that you will actually critically deconstruct, critically go in and figure out where the things you hold as most valuable to yourself, the ideas and the notions and the beliefs and the habits, you'll really look at those and see if there's room for improvement, if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, etc., etc. So, a good place to start is just asking yourself this question about human nature, right? And more than likely, this is what I'm going to ask your essays for you to do for your essay that'll be due next week. Is I'm probably going to ask you to write about your basic assumptions of human nature, because whatever your basic assumption of human nature is, that's going to already not change, but it's going to almost predetermine how you view what people do. So if you have a bad idea of human nature, meaning that you believe human nature is essentially evil, or human nature is essentially bad, or human nature is simply off course, you very likely are going to see every single thing that happens as a consequence of that human nature being bad. But if you see human nature as a good thing, if you see human nature as basically blessed, if you see human nature as basically free, then you're going to look at activities and you're going to be like, well, a person might have made a mistake this time, but they can always change, or this situation is untenable, and so therefore, because human beings are basically good, we can strive together and we can change it. This is really the basis of the discussion that's going on right now in the United States of America. I call it a discussion. Is that pretty much you can say. It's a safe bet to say that people who lean right have a dim view of human nature and believe there needs to be some sort of exterior entity, whether God or a leader or something like that, who sort of forces human beings to do the right thing. And then The left, on the other hand, usually leans in the direction of humans are basically good, and if we just got rid of a lot of these superstitious structures that we have, then you'd see that. But until we do that, you won't see it. So really, a lot of our disagreements that are going on right now in human society actually have to do with this ability to reduce human nature down to evil or to reduce human nature down to good. So what we want to do is just challenge the assumption. Is there such a thing as human nature? What is human nature? Is human nature all bad? Or do people start off assholes and then they can become better? Or do they start off saints and then they become worse? I mean, this is the sort of thing that we should be asking ourselves. What do you actually believe, wholeheartedly believe inside of yourself, right? So in the process of attempting to search through all these basic assumptions, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to look at more than just American thinkers, more than just European thinkers. We want to look at people from across different cultural spectrums. And the reason for doing that, because all cultures, belief structures, law structures, customary structures, all those things are made by human beings, and they are built off of assumptions, presuppositions, and predeterminations that over time begin to never be asked about and never be checked. So if you actually look at, contemporary 21st century America, and then you turn and you look at 4th century BCE Greece, or you turn and you look at 5th century BCE India, or you turn and you look at ancient China, you're going to see different customs, different ways of thinking about the world. And none of those is privileged, right? As a philosopher, you have to at some point challenge the assumption that my people have a privilege above all other people. So the best way to do that is to look at the diversity of what I would rather call thinkering instead of philosophy, the diversity of thinkering around the world. And the reason I say thinkering is because philosophy itself is a Western European term, and it's not not everybody developed a term for it. There is a term in every language for thinking. There's not a term in every language for that kind of critical, speculative thinking we call philosophy. So what we're going to be doing is looking at the diversity of thinkering, and that means going to a lot of different cultures, right? Look at Indian, African, Asian thinkers, woman philosophers, gay philosophers. We get outside the bounds of what we consider quote-unquote normal, right, into another area. So as we're going through and we're looking at these different kinds of ways of rethinking and challenging our basic assumptions, we also want to look at the three basic questions. What is knowledge? What is real? What is right and good? Right? And again, your basic idea of human nature has already made a determination in how you answer what is knowledge, what is real, and what is right and good. So we call what is knowledge questions of epistemology. That means the study of knowledge. Actually, this word epistemology here can be broken up into episteme, which is the Greek word for knowledge, and logos, which is the Greek word for study or account. Obviously it's in the root of most scientific terms like biology and physiology and stuff like that. But epistemology means an account or a study of how we know. And this word episteme is actually really cool because as a word in Greek, it literally means to draw close. So this is an account of how we come most close to what we can know. Right? So it's the study of knowledge. And in that regard, I'd also kind of point out here that this KN and know actually means can. Right? So knowledge actually is about what we can do. In other words, it's close enough to us. It's something we actually have. It's something that comes out of our interaction with the world, and we can do something with it, right? The only thing you can do with a good opinion is try to persuade people differently. But if you actually have knowledge, you can build things, you can create things, you can show people, you can demonstrate to people certain things. And this is really kind of very important structure for us to really think about at the moment, because how can we account for a way to draw close to the kind of knowing and information that allows us to better live in the world, better thrive? So, and what's the difference between data and facts, and the difference between facts and information, and the difference between bless me, and the difference between information and knowledge, and then, even more, what role does belief play in how we know, or whatever, right? So you might try at this point to write out a couple of questions that actually ask how you know something is true, or how you know something is right. And then, take a look at a broad array of people that we're looking at now in this first chapter. And, ask yourself, how does the feminist philosopher see this? How does the queer philosopher see this? How does the ancient Greek philosopher, how does the Indian Buddhist see this? These are the kind of things that we want to do when we study knowledge. Now, metaphysics is the study of reality or existence. And what metaphysics actually means literally is beyond the physical. Okay, this term actually is a term invented by librarians in the Library of Alexandria, and it literally was just to say that the text by Aristotle called Metaphysics occurred on the shelf after the text by Aristotle called Physics. But over time, this term, metaphysica, this term came to be a technical term in philosophy, and it really does have a technical meaning. It's not just speculative thinking. Okay, if you go to Barnes and Nobles or any bookstore nowadays and you walk down the philosophy aisle, you'll also stumble into something called the metaphysics aisle. Metaphysics aisle at Barnes and Noble is tarot cards, astrology, New Age, reincarnation, and channeling books. That's what it is. That's the tall end of metaphysics, where it's purely speculative and it's basically confused with magic. Metaphysics in philosophy is actually about the study of reality or existence, and more particularly, there's one form here called ontology, which means more particularly the study of being. Okay, metaphysics addresses, like, how do we know what's real? What is reality? So there's metaphysics in science. While physics itself as a discipline, which is the study of motion, how things move, why things move, etc., physics as a discipline is scientific, and it eschews that kind of woo-woo metaphysics that we'd associate with the New Age. It's still metaphysical. When you start talking about string theory, or you start talking the way most people talk about quantum mechanics, or you start talking even about the Big Bang, you're getting into metaphysical questions, right? It's just a scientific metaphysics. It's a rigorous metaphysics that only allows for certain things to be considered worth the speculation. So, you want to take a look over the Halbach and the Frankel, so that you can kind of see two people really going at trying to understand metaphysics as something more than just idle speculation. And then, of course, we have right and wrong, ethics. The word ethics itself is a Greek word that means habit or custom, or characteristic custom. So it's the study of values, meaning here, when we say values, we don't mean, ethics is worth $10. We mean the study of values in the sense of, what do you value? A lot of, if we really think about the pandemic at the moment, a lot of the discussion that's happened over the last 6 months is not just politics, it's also ethics. And it's an ethics of, do you value money and economic security over health and basic survival? And of course, some people will make the argument, well, if you don't have a job, you can't survive, and so therefore it's really the same thing. And other people will come back and say, no, you're really collapsing these values down a little bit. Yes, it's true that a person needs to struggle to make a living so they can survive, and that needs to happen, however, but in an emergency, the question becomes, does the economic system that we've been used to, in other words, we're asking us to examine our basic assumptions, does the economic system that we've been used to heretofore actually value the profits of a few over the health of the all? That's a real question being asked right now. Is it just that some people have a certain kind of financial security, and because everybody depends on their financial security, we need to make sure that we don't change that? So actually, in a sense, politics always in some way results back into ethics. But the politics will be colored, it comes back into ethics. It's also going to be colored by what's your view of human nature. If you think that humans are basically evil or humans are basically sinful, you more than likely are going to believe there need to be really strict structures and that ethics needs to be built into the law, etc., etc., etc. But if you believe that human beings are basically good, then you basically believe that the only ethics that need to be built into the law are the ones that keep other people from taking advantage of the majority, keep a few people from taking advantage of the majority of people. So here you can, kind of take a look at some questions, come up with some questions for yourself that you believe are ethical questions, and, examine some ethical assumptions, like the ones that were called into question by Gandhi and responses, egoist philosopher of Harry Brown. So, is ethics about thinking of the whole before you think of yourself? Is ethics about thinking of yourself before you think of the whole? Is it about finding the right kind of balance, knowing the difference in different situations, etc.? Okay? So, obviously, it's not just epistemology, ontology, axiology, if we were to use the ology terms. It's not just epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. It's also, philosophy can be a philosophy of particular disciplines, right? I think I said in my little piece I had you read Get Philosophy into Your Lexicon, I think that I pointed out the fact that anybody who gets a PhD is technically a philosopher in whatever their discipline is, right? So if you get a PhD in physics, you are a doctor of philosophy of physics. If you get, which means you can philosophize physics. Physics is going to mostly be philosophized in very mathematical, very scientific ways, and it's not going to have room for a lot of crazy woo-woo speculation, right? But then when you turn to the philosophy of art, now you've turned to something totally different, right? You're talking about aesthetics, about taste, about, how people perceive things. And then, of course, political philosophy, which sometimes tries to just make everything as scientific as possible, and other times tries to, build ethics into politics. So our philosopher in action, and he's usually the first person we start with, is Socrates. And Socrates, of course, actually, it's quite possible Socrates invented or at least popularized the term philosophy, because he didn't feel right calling himself sophos, calling himself wise. And he really kind of thought of his life as more of a performance of seeking after that which tends to hide. And in this sense, it's not nature or the God so much as it is liberation and freedom. What happened is that before Socrates, about 150 years before Socrates, people started asking lots of questions about nature and about so about metaphysics, about epistemology, and about ethics. And by the time Socrates came on the scene, in one sense, there was so much of an intellectual furor going on with people being highly interested in the metaphysical that Socrates began to ask questions about what it means to be human, right? So again, we're kind of back at that: what is human nature? What is the human condition? How do we human as humans? Those kind of things became what Socrates cared about, because we're the ones asking these questions. We're the ones that are doing these experiments. We're the ones that are doing this critical engagement. So the thing that really kind of needs to be looked at is us, because we're the ones that are going to make a determination about what's important to us, right? And if you don't examine yourself, right, then you're never going to really know the instrument that's doing all of the interaction with the world, right? But anyway, the way that he did this was mostly through what's called dialogue, which is just talking to people, sometimes strangers, usually people that he at least was acquainted with. Sometimes great friends or younger people who were the children of his friends. And the basic idea is that he talked to a lot of people who got really pissed off because he showed that they didn't know as much as they pretended to know, when all he was doing was going around saying, I know that I don't know, what about you? And they'd all say, oh, I know about this. And what he realized, and this comes out in the Dialogues of Plato, it really comes up nicely. Plato was a younger man that Socrates befriended, who was the nephew of Socrates' great friend Crito. And Socrates befriended Plato, and then Plato sort of became enamored with his mentor, and he ended up writing all these dialogues to remember the things Socrates had said. And then later, as time went by, as he got older and Socrates was gone and he got older, he began to write stories in which Socrates said plausible things that Socrates might have said. But that would be later on when you begin to sort of see Plato use Socrates to voice his own thinking. But the major idea here is that you do have a really nice memory of how Socrates basically operated, and you get a good idea of why he pissed a lot of people off, because he made them look kind of stupid. His idea wasn't so much to make them look stupid as it was to get them to see that they too needed to be critiquing their basic assumptions, considering what their presuppositions are, and trying to rid themselves of unnecessary beliefs. So, again, we don't know for sure whether, I think you could probably say the Apology is not a direct, which is the defense of Socrates in court, and the Euthyphro are not one-to-one recordings of exactly what happened, but they're very close to what happened. Whereas as you go deeper in, like the Republic, it's just sort of the middle part of Plato's career, Socrates begins to not necessarily be saying things Socrates himself said, but sort of it's the logical direction Plato thought Socrates' thinking would go. But with the Euthyphro, what we have is Socrates showing up before his court appointment and running into someone who is suing somebody else for the thing that Socrates himself is being accused of. So Socrates has been accused, categorized. The word category means accusation in the marketplace, accusation of someone in the accusing someone publicly of something. So he'd been categorized as impious, meaning that he was irreverent of the things that Athenians believed to be reverent. Euthyphro is actually on his way to court to try his own father. Euthyphro is categorizing his own father as impious, as irreverent of life. And Socrates is like, well, I'm being accused of being irreverent, of being impious, and here's someone who obviously knows what impiety is because he's suing his own father for it. So he has this discussion with Euthyphro outside the courtroom before his trial. And it's an interesting it's an interesting discussion because it makes us realize that sometimes we don't know why we consider something to be holy or sacred or do certain kind of reverence. We just accept it. And when you stop and you try to figure out, if reverence or sacredness or holiness has to do with the gods or God or the divine, is it holy or sacred? Right? So it's this thing here. Do the gods love what is holy because it is holy in itself, right? Whether the gods loved it or not, it would be holy. Or is it holy because the gods love it? And again, this gets us to actually one of our basic assumptions about human nature, our basic assumptions about what it means to be an American, or what it means to be whatever we may call ourselves, right? There are certain things that we hold in reverence, that we hold as sacred, right? That we hold as holy, and we elevate those things. But do we hold them as holy because there's something about them that would be holy whether we actually thought that? Or are they just holy because we customarily believe them to be that way? We think of them that way, so therefore they get that power. So it's the same thing here going on with the gods. So Socrates realizes that Euthyphro is actually someone who wants to use the gods in court to prove that he knows what piety is and that his father is impious, that he knows what reverence is and his father is irreverent, that he knows what holiness is and his father is acting unholy. But he can't actually tell you what it is once he's actually pushed into a corner. Right? And this is really where Socrates pisses the experts off. When the experts are pushed into a corner where they can't actually say what they think. And this Socratic method, this kind of Socratic method is still very popular nowadays. But what I see mostly when I see it happen on YouTube or I see it happen online is I see a bad faith effort at a Socratic dialogue. Like people like Ben Shapiro or Steven Crowder have a tendency to use what appears to be the Socratic method, but it's really more of a kind of debate technique where you just pepper people with questions, and then when you do a lot of straw mans, you create a lot of easily you reposition the person's thinking in a way where you can knock it over easy. That's what a straw man is. Or you just bring out a lot of stuff that actually are logical fallacies, and it gets it to a point where the person you're talking to is not actually allowed to really explore what they're trying to say because you're just trying to win the argument. And that's actually the difference between Socrates and sophists. So I would actually say today that people like Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder are sophists, but they use something like the Socratic method. Lawyers do this. It's no big secret that someone like Ben Shapiro is actually a Yale-trained attorney, and he uses all of the tricks of being a sophist, of being an attorney, to try to make people think that he's won an argument when actually he's not advanced hardly anything, and he certainly hasn't really examined the basic assumptions of the argument, right? So this is, to me, a place where you can see the real difference between Socrates and the people who Socrates was the most critical of and who really Socrates pissed off. So Socrates isn't trying to win an argument. Socrates is just trying to examine basic assumptions. And then people who want to win an argument and persuade people that they're right, or persuade people that they know what's going on, so that people will give them more power, those people don't like it when someone comes along who's not trying to win the argument and is just exploring basic assumptions. Now, we get into the Republic, And with the Republic, you really have, I really recommend this to every single class that I ever teach, every person that I meet. They'll give me more than a few minutes to talk about it. There are very few books written in the world's history that are as important as the Republic. For diverse reasons I'm not going to go into now, but the Republic is deserving of your close attention and something you should read from cover to cover. And if you ever have a chance in college to take a course only on Plato's Republic, do it. Okay? But in the selection of the Republic that we get in Chapter 1, we're actually asking this, of course, this is basically what the book is about, and it's asking this question, what is justice? I want to make a little amendment here and say what it's actually asking is this: what is just togetherness? Okay, because the word that's translated as justice is this term dikaiozune. It's Greek, and it literally means zune, means it's the same as symphony. It's also the same as cone or cum in Latin, and what that means is together or with. And then the dike here is the word for justice. But in this sense, what it's actually getting at is, so what we would normally, the word that would normally be translated as justice is dike. So when we translate dikaizune as justice, that's the right term, but it's really trying to get at justly together. Like, in other words, so when the purpose of this dialogue actually is not just to understand what justice is, and then, you know, almost all of us would have a hard time saying what justice is, but more than anything else, it's trying to get us to see how can we live together justly. Okay, so what Thrasymachus does, and Thrasymachus is one of those sophists that I was talking about. Thrasymachus is the Ben Shapiro of Athens, and Thrasymachus, what Thrasymachus does is he basically comes out and says, well, really, you know, I think justice is whatever the stronger want it to be. And then finally he ends up in this situation where he makes the claim that the best thing to do is actually to be unjust but appear to be just. Right? And that's a kind of interesting thing, because a lot of times in American life, our basic assumptions, one of our basic assumptions is that if something is not illegal, it's not unethical. That's business ethics 101. If I'm doing something that's not illegal, I'm not doing something unethical. But is that true? Right? That just makes it look like, well, if I'm not doing something illegal, it looks like I'm doing something just, or it looks like I'm doing something legal because it's not illegal. So therefore, it's just. That doesn't make any sense, right? So Socrates goes after this in two different ways, and the first is to go after, you know, Thrasymachus's first position, which is it's the advantage of the stronger, and then he attempts to go at his second position when he, you know, begins to move the goalpost. Thrasymachus moves the goalpost, a common habit among sophists. He moves the goalpost and he says, well, really, you know, that's just all a bunch of BS. I'm just saying what people want to hear. In all reality, we know that justice is a load of shit, and therefore we need to just appear to be just. And, you know, I think that probably bears out in your experience of American politics on both sides of the aisle, as well as American corporate business. And finally, with the apology, we have the continuation, right? So of what began outside the courthouse with Euthyphro now goes into the apology, and you meet these people who are accusing Socrates of being irreverent, unholy, impious, that he's corrupting the youth, that he's, you know, doing all these bad things. And what Socrates attempts to do here is simply demonstrate that he couldn't be this evil person that everybody says he is, because he's just this bumbling old man who doesn't actually necessarily know the truth. The only thing he knows is that he's ignorant, and he's looking for other people who are wiser than him to help him understand. This is his basic argument. So you can go through here and you can get kind of an idea. It's sort of an autobiographical expression, or quasi-autobiographical expression of how Socrates found his way to philosophizing, because he was curious first about nature and then became very curious about human beings. And then he comes to realize, well, maybe the God or somebody says that there's no one wiser than me. But when after I tested that out, I came to understand that what that means is, everybody's equally ignorant, not that I'm the wisest person. Crito demonstrates Socrates' post-trial, when he's been given the death penalty because he pissed off the jury. And Plato's uncle, Crito, who had been a longtime friend and supporter of Socrates, comes and says, basically, I've arranged for you to be able to escape. And Socrates is like, buddy, I'm not going to ever abandon the search for truth, beauty, and joy. I'm not leaving my home. Athens is my mother. Athens and her customs are my mother. I'm not abandoning this place because everybody decided that I'm not good enough to live here. I'm not going to run off and prove them right. And he tries to convince Crito that it's important to examine our basic assumptions, but that we also have to understand that we live in a customary society, and that those societies' customs should be respected up to a point, and understand how those customs make us who we are, right? So therefore, we can't just abandon what's made us who we are. We should at least continue to struggle as long as we can. So maybe we can create a crack in all of this that will allow for unhealthy assumptions to be done away with, or harmful practices to be abandoned. And really, so this becomes a question of, is there an obligation to obey the law? How is the law interpreted? I mean, law it's both stricter in 400 BCE and less strict, right? They didn't really have a police state. They didn't have public prosecutors. They had people who, went around and tried to keep the peace, and anybody could go to the public courts and could haul anybody in for having committed a crime. But, there wasn't an elaborate state structure like we have, police state structure like we have of police and law enforcement officers and correction officers and prosecutor offices and all the rest of that kind of stuff. Athens in this regard was a true democracy, in the sense that anybody who was a male citizen was expected to perform certain honors and certain duties throughout the course of their life. And among these was keeping an eye out for troublemakers, and also for bringing people who really done something bad to trial, making everyone aware of what they'd done. And then the question becomes, so if we do to the law, if we treat the law herself like she's someone that we could dialogue with, and we begin to think about the laws themselves as entities with which we can exchange and converse, examinations of the laws should begin to tell us pretty quickly whether or not we have vague or ambiguous terms, which could lead to all kinds of nonsense, whether or not the basic assumption of the law is debatable, which things, about the law might be acceptable to the majority of people. And, here would be a great place for y'all to practice how you would counter Socrates' arguments. Okay? and maybe even kind of understand. We've come to understand post Gandhi, post Martin Luther King. There's post, and Gandhi himself was inspired by the American writer Henry Thoreau. We've come to understand that there's a thing called civil disobedience, and civil disobedience is where you do things with minor laws to sort of show that you're questioning the direction of the legal structure, or you're questioning the direction of the legal system. Looks like the gods agree with this. Got a big thunderclap just now. And so, that's when you should be asking yourself, when is it actually okay to disobey the law? And of course, again, we're in a situation, this is in one sense, it's a great semester to be taking a philosophy course, because we're living through a time when we're being asked to actually think through every one of our basic assumptions. So there's a lot going on right now about all of these kinds of things. So what's the value of doing philosophy? Well, hopefully, just by the things I brought up that have to do with our daily lives, that I can connect back to these old figures like Socrates and Buddha, and how we need to really sort of turn ourselves toward the loving struggle for real freedom, to build our own views of life, so that we don't just take what's given to us and say, well, it was good enough for my grandfathers, therefore it's good enough for me. And also how we can grow awareness in ourselves and learn to think critically. That's really the most important stuff, is, learning to actually struggle to determine your liberation, and how your liberation can help others achieve their liberation, and how our collective struggle for liberation comes back to provide more, means for us to be free, right? But it really does begin. I'm very Socratic in this regard, and I think you see this as a truism in the teachings of Jesus and Buddha and Lao Tzu and Confucius and any host of people over the course of human history. If you don't start with yourself and exploring yourself, you're not really starting in the right place. So know thyself is always the place to start. So in the readings that we've done, there's one reading, The Story of a Good Brahmin by Voltaire, that you might take a look at, because the basic idea here, and it's one that Socrates sort of embodies as well, is the idea it's better to be in the, you might call, despair of philosophy, that is, having lost our kind of rose-colored glass view of our customs and our laws and our basic assumptions, and really sort of give ourselves over to this philosophizing, than just to sort of wallow in ignorant contentment. So you might, consider that. I'm thinking about making this part of the discussion for next week, actually. So we'll see. All right, y'all. I don't really have anything else to say about this. I hope that me going through here kind of, threw some light on what we're up to. I just want to reiterate that for me, philosophizing is the willingness to be uncertain and the will to ask questions. And I kind of think that everything I've talked about today really goes at the heart of that. That we have to learn how to be willing to be uncertain if we're going to actually achieve liberty. And therefore we have to be willing, we have to have a will to question everything we come across in the right moment at the right time. Okay. I will talk to y'all. Hopefully some of y'all show up for the meeting on Thursday.